Josh Hennig along with PJ Corda as we are live at the Make the World Better Pickleball Tournament in Sea Isle City. Kevin Durso is our Flyers Insider over at 97.3 ESPN.com, and he's joining us right now on 97.3 ESPN. Kevin, welcome in. I know you've had a busy couple days here. How's it going, my man? All right, Nick, you're going to have to turn Durso up because we cannot hear him. Go ahead, Kevin. Or is that on your end, Kevin? Because I heard something crack over there.
Yeah, do you have me now?
Oh, we got you. Okay. All right, Nick, sorry, I blamed you. It was Durso's fault.
That's my bad. Sorry, guys.
So, Kevin, it's crazy couple days for you. First, let's start with this, okay? Mm-hmm. I want to know for you, overall, okay, not just, yesterday, but today as well with the second round pick. Are you giving the Flyers a thumbs up, an okay? Like, how are you feeling about what the organization has done the last 2 days combined? Let's start with that.
Probably an incomplete at the moment, just because there's a lot of work still to be done with some of these prospects. I really like what they did today to kind of balance out what they started on Friday night. The Porter Martone pick is really one of the better ones you can make in the first round. He was projected top 5 all along by, in a lot of cases, top 3, honestly. Clearly the best natural winger in the draft. The real criticism here, and the only risk to me about the pick, is not through any fault of Martone. It's that he's not a center, and the team needs a lot of center help. And you had James Hagan sitting there on the board for you at 6, and that's where a lot of people probably would have liked to see you go, especially when you consider what they did with the second pick, the trade up. That, the way I view it is Jack Nesbitt, the second pick they made on Friday, I would say he's a top 10 center in the draft for guys that, if you look at the way that people evaluate centers when it comes to a draft, you're picking guys who are 17, 18 years old. So a lot of times you get guys who play center for their entire lives, and this ties into the trade they made this week with Trevor Zegras. Up until 2 years ago, Zegras had played center his entire career, his entire life, and in comes a head coach like Greg Cronin in Anaheim and says, nah, I just don't see it. You're a winger, and puts him on the wing. That's what tends to happen to guys who get drafted at 17, 18 years old. They've played center. They look like they're going to be a center, and then you figure out that it just doesn't equate to being a center at the NHL level, and they get bumped to the wing. That might be what people think about Hagan's, honestly, that they think that his size is going to equate better to being a winger. And in that case, this is in, apples to apples comparison. They both are top line projected type players. So Martone's a great pick because he's got top line potential. Nesbitt might have a better chance of sticking in center, but the projection is second line center at best, and a lot has to go right for that to happen. So now you start to tend to go lower than that. You get a guy who's more of a checking line kind of guy, and that doesn't equate to 12th overall pick. So that's where people don't like it. That said, I think what they did in the second round today makes up for it a lot. They got a lot of good value with some of the picks they made. I really like the decision to trade back from 36 to add another pick in the second round again, to kind of go back to what they had at the start of the week, that they had 4 second round picks. I really like that decision, and clearly the emphasis was on size. They didn't pick a guy who's under 6'1", so clearly they emphasized getting bigger, and that could go a long way in the future.
So with that being said, because we kind of made this analogy, Kevin, earlier about the NBA Finals, that the Sixers were drafting guys kind of fit the mold of what OKC and the Pacers like to do. So are the Flyers looking at teams like the Panthers and teams like the Lightning and the Avalanche and the other top teams in the league and saying there's a certain style the teams are winning with and that's who we're drafting? Or is there a philosophy coming from Briere, Tocchet, and Jones that's being executed here?
A little bit of both, because the picks definitely reflect a Rick Tocchet style team, no question about it. The reason why I'm calling it both, though, is because when Porter Martone got drafted by the Flyers, the first comparison that comes out for him is Matthew Tkachuk. So right. Take a page out of the Florida Panthers book, add some size to the picture here, and I don't see anything wrong with that. They were already kind of an undersized team to begin with, and they've made picks that reflect it. Jet Lachenko last year, smaller guy at center. Matvei Michkov, super skilled, but smaller guy, and they kind of need some size around him. I texted with you last night, Josh, and kind of told you Martone fits into a top line mold here. And I don't know that Zegras is going to be the long-term, hey, he's a 1C kind of guy. I still think they're looking for that 1C, and that's why a lot of people wanted Hagens over Martone. And I think that once people see Martone play, they're going to change their mind about that and at least really like the pick for what he is. I think at least Martone's close. Like, sometimes you make selections like this. Like, Nesbitt's going to be a guy that's a work in progress. You're not going to see him at the NHL level for several years at this point. Martone, on the other hand, maybe has an outside shot this year. I think he's definitely an NHL player the following season in 26-27. I think he is for sure on the roster. He's already, again, something we kind of touched on last night when we were texting. He got, after his junior season was over, got pulled to play for Team Canada in World Championships, which is not World Juniors where you're all playing with under 20 guys. That's NHLers. He's on a roster with Sidney Crosby and Nathan McKinnon when their seasons were over, and also happened to be on a roster with Travis Konechny, Travis Sanheim, and Tyson Forrester, who had glowing reviews of him. So certainly there was some input from active Flyers on that pick, and that's why they felt comfortable making it.
Alex, you got a question for Durso over there?
I do. With Martone, being a winger, I feel as though if they would have taken Hagens, they would have had a little bit more leeway with the Zegras situation, not knowing whether they want him up the middle or on the wing. With taking Martone, does that put a little bit more pressure on Zegras and the Flyers to make sure, hey, we got our center here with Zegras, our top-line center?
Yeah, I don't know if it puts more pressure on Zegras himself. I think he's just got to go and play his game. It puts pressure on making that decision because as much as it was a good value trade to make to get a high-end talent like Zegras can be, you don't know if you've solved that center issue yet. And the hard part here is that, at least in my estimation, this is the last year that they think they're going to be picking in this kind of range. So I don't think you're going to find that guy in the draft next year because you just don't expect to be picking in the range to get a top line center. So now if Zegras is not that answer, even if Zegras is a second line center for you, I'm just not sure where you find that guy because you can bank on free agency next year, but a lot of teams are able to keep a lot of their guys. It's just not an ideal scenario to just say, okay, we can snap our fingers and go grab anybody else. I've talked before, Connor McDavid's a free agent next year, but do we really think he's making it to free agency? Let's be realistic. You're not just going to be able to snap your fingers, throw some money at him and then say, we've got the number 1C and that's it. It's over. It's not that simple. So there's risk involved because if you're going to trade up, especially when you trade 2 first-round picks, you better be right about your decisions. I've said that going back to when they started with hiring Tocchet. You make that decision first. You now have to go through the draft process. You have to get everything right. I think they're going to look back on Martone and feel they got that one right. Nesbitt, I'm not sure about just yet, and that's where the risk is involved. That you take a chance on a guy, but you better see the development through, and a big part of it is his skating. They feel like they can fix his skating. They feel like they were able to do that with Tyson Forrester, and they feel like they've taken other players that they feel like they can, and that's going to be the big thing.
Talking with Kevin Durso, our Flyers Insider from 97.3 ESPN.com at Kevin_Durso on the Twitter X platform. Of course, check out all of his Flyers coverage, comprehensive, at 97.3 ESPN.com. We are live here at Connor Barwin's Make the World Better Pickleball Tournament in Sea Isle City under the spiked iced tea tent here, keeping us out of the sunshine right now. And, of course, our title sponsor, Zia Nicola Pizza, brought us lunch today here, so we thank them on the Sea Isle Boardwalk. Kevin, let's get back to the ice here because, you mentioned, you and I were talking yesterday about, and I asked the guys earlier, and they kind of were like wishy-washy on my question about this. So maybe you can give me a more juicy answer with this. Maybe not. But, it is a little weird for the Flyers to trade with a rival like the Penguins. Yeah. And give the Penguins, extra shots in the... Now, I've seen a lot of analysts who looked at the Penguins' picks and poo-pooed those 2 picks. But still, you gave a big rival of yours who, if you get good, they're probably going to be good around the same time, right? You're giving them ammunition. So was that a weird trade for you last night?
You don't expect to see it, that's for sure. You don't tend to expect cross-state rivals to make trades on a regular basis. It wasn't completely unexpected because the Penguins happened, it was literal days before the draft, inherited the 12th overall pick because it was a conditional choice that the Rangers had. The Rangers preferred to keep the 2026 pick and not subject that to Pittsburgh. So by doing that, it actually made it a likely trade-up destination for the Flyers. That was the one thing I wasn't surprised about, is that they were going to look to try to move up and potentially package those picks. I was a little surprised that they would be that willing to move 22 and 31 at the same time like that. I really thought that if they were going to do something like that, it might be a little closer to 22 that they would make the trade, and then they would trade 22 and 36 or 22 and 40 and still try to keep one of those other first-round picks. They had 3 in the first round. I think that today they leveraged that well with the trade they made in the second round, but it was surprising to see. And the thing is that like when we're looking at all these draft picks and things like that, it's hard to evaluate today on what teams got, because especially in this year's draft, it was as soon as we got to 10th or 11th overall, as soon as we got through the top 10, it was all over the place. The pick that the Penguins made at 11 surprised me. The pick that the Flyers made at 12 surprised me. And then there were some guys that fell as a result that didn't surprise me soon after. So that's kind of how I view that whole situation.
I asked you this question last night on text. I'm going to ask you again here. Should they have traded for a player? Should they have traded maybe 22 overall for somebody who's an established player, maybe like a defenseman or someone?
For this one, I'm going to align in agreement with Emily Kaplan on the ESPN broadcast last night and say it was a little disappointing that there wasn't player trades involved, because there was a lot of smoke about stuff. And to be honest, I think I kind of saw through some of that. I saw a lot of conversation about that big things might happen, and I just wasn't sure that it was really going to be there. I think that one key part of it was the decentralized draft. The teams couldn't just walk over to a table next to them and start talking about stuff. It kind of led you to make picks, trading picks, but not trade players. I just don't think the market was there for it. We've seen a few player trades today, but doesn't amount to the same kind of hype. Like, I think people thought that there was going to be a really big move somewhere out there, a legit near all-star level player, and you kind of got second, third tier guys instead maybe moving, and that just didn't move the needle as much. Like, the Noah Dobson getting moved to Montreal for a couple of draft picks, and the issue with that is that the drama was out of it. That got announced at the first round, but it was out there 3 hours before the draft started, so there's no real drama to that. So I don't think that you had that kind of background for this. I don't think that you just had that drama that people wanted to see where something crazy happened. Like I think about the year that the Flyers moved Braden Shen and got the 27th overall pick that was Morgan Frost eventually. That trade felt like it came out of nowhere. That all of a sudden Braden Shen's on the move. What is this? We didn't expect player movement. That's crazy. None of that happened last night, and I think people were a little disappointed after a few days of a lot of talk and no action.
Okay, so now draft's wrapping up this weekend. Next week, free agency opens up. Flyers, they have opened up some salary cap. Not crazy salary cap, right, Kevin? But they at least have something they might be able to work with. Kevin Durso, what is a realistic expectation for the Flyers offseason?
Well, with free agency, it's kind of stopgap options for now. They're not going to go and be able to get anybody super significant. Some of those guys are already off the board anyway. There was, you can think about maybe if you're looking to solve some of the center woes, John Tavares was available as a free agent, and he kind of took a hometown discount to continue playing with Toronto, and I don't think that would have been the case if he went anywhere else. And you're going to see a lot of guys try to kind of maintain their situation a little bit, like Sam Bennett did. You're in a good spot, in Florida. You're winning, win back-to-back cups. You got a great shot of being able to go again next year and at least contend for a Stanley Cup. Take the discount and continue playing, and see if what you left on the table doesn't allow for you to keep some of the other guys that Florida could be losing going forward. For the Flyers, I'm going a little bit step lower on this. I don't think they're going to do anything drastic. I do think they want to address goaltending. That would be the obvious spot. They're going to be in the Jake Allen sweepstakes, which is kind of for me, it's a weird sentence to say because Jake Allen is not the name I would put with sweepstakes, but he's the best goalie available on the free agent market, and that's about as far as you can take it right now. I wouldn't.
Can I press on that real quick?
Yeah, sure.
Is he the best? Is he the best goaltender free agent?
He's one of the top three, probably at least, and the goaltending market keeps shrinking. Joel Hofer is another goalie who was supposedly going to be on the market. He was an RFA, possibly an offer sheet candidate. He just re-upped with St. Louis. You think I wouldn't have been in on this one, but John Gibson was a name that was floated around. He just got traded to Detroit today. Gibson's injury history worries me, so I wouldn't have done that. And had to spend what they would have had to spend to get him. there's other options besides Jake Allen for sure. Ilya Samsonov is out there. I personally like Dan Vladar or David Riddick as a backup option to Sam Harrison. Certainly more stable than Ivan Fedotov.
I like Riddick. Riddick would be the guy I would pick over Allen.
And I think
what about Hart? What about if he gets exonerated? Can he not come back?
I don't see it happening.
No,
I just don't see it happening. And to be honest, they're already waiting until mid-July to even find out about that. The teams aren't going to sit around and wait to make decisions on that early in a free agent. I think if you're not finished kind of putting together your team in the first week of July and really have a clear idea, then you're falling behind pretty quick. So I don't see them waiting for that. To your point, Josh, Riddick is a guy who I think that you could get. I think they would want to get a guy who would be willing to take a 2-year deal max and maybe be in between $2 and $3 million. That would be ideal. And I think Riddick falls in that line. I think Vladar falls into that line. And Vladar played behind Dustin Wolf in Calgary last year and had really, again, another goalie with some good numbers for a team that didn't score a lot, really relied on goaltending. I think that would at least be a step in the right direction. It's not the final product by any stretch. Other than that, a name I do want to put out there at center position at least is Pius Suter, because Suter played for Vancouver last year, had a career year under Rick Tocchet, scored 25 goals. His previous career high had been 15. He's not going to be, again, it's not a guy who falls into your top 6, but I think it could be a really good fit for the Flyers if that's something they were trying to look to add as well.
All right, Kevin, before I let you go, because I wrote my article on 973ESPN.com, the greatest what-ifs in the last 15 years in Philly sports. So I want to give you the Flyer ones and get some of your reactions, all right? So number 13, what if the Flyers win Game 1 of the 2020-10 Stanley Cup Finals?
That one's an interesting one to me because when they came back down 2-0 when they came home in that series, and then they won the next 2 games. If they could just win one of the first 2 games, specifically that Game 1 where they had the lead a couple different times and then lost 6-5, if they could win that game and Game 6 becomes a potential cup-clinching scenario on home ice, I do wonder how that game plays out slightly differently. I mean, they got that game to overtime before losing, and that's when the Cup was won by Chicago for the first time, their first of 3 in 6 years. But could it have been different if they would have gotten one of those first 2 games in Chicago, and Game 1 was probably a little bit more there for the taking than Game 2 was? So I agree. That's a really interesting what if, just because you never know what would have happened if they could have just gotten out in front of that series a little more instead of having to try to play desperation hockey down 2-0 and get it tied and then really have no room for error when you're a little more spent for Games 5 and 6.
Number 9 was what if Nolan Patrick was worth being selected 2nd overall by the Flyers?
Yeah, see, this is the first one that comes to my mind when you talk about what ifs, because, there's a lot of what if scenarios with this one too, because it's what if Nolan Patrick worked out and they have a guy who they think is a really good center. What if they pick Cale Makar and they have a top pair defenseman, a Norris winning defenseman? I kind of also sit there and I was thinking about this as you guys were having this conversation today about it. What if Nolan Patrick's path doesn't go the way that it does? Do they have Matvei Michkov? Because they might not ever go into a rebuild and pick in the top 10 at that time. So if you like Matvei Michkov a lot, I think Nolan Patrick's career path kind of sets you up for that to a degree. So it kind of goes all over the place. But I think at the time, one of the big what ifs about Nolan Patrick, if it would have worked out, is I kind of wonder what if they would have ever traded Claude Giroux as a result, because if they would have remained in contention longer, Giroux may have been a career Flyer for real at that point. It only got to that point because a lot wasn't working out for you, more than Nolan Patrick. The goaltending was still a problem. At that point in time, they were still trying to recover some defensive prospects as well. They didn't really have a lot going for them defensively either. It kind of turned into, it necessitated the situation to move Giroux to get something back, versus if Patrick would have worked out and they would have had a couple more things go their way better, they might have been able to just roll with that straight into this decade and see where it goes.
And finally, I had a number 7 overall. What if the Flyers don't trade Bobrovsky and overpay Brizgalov?
That's an interesting one to me. It's certainly one of the biggest what ifs they have. I'm not denying that. The interesting part is, and again, I heard you guys talking about this, there's a little piece of the story that you guys didn't have in there, though, that made that trade happen. Bobrovsky wanted to be a starter, and wanted to be a starter very early in his career. Russian players, especially, just when they play in the KHL or they're close to the KHL level as a young player, they're kind of taught that their league is the second best league. You're either an NHL player or you should play in the KHL. And I think Bobrovsky probably at that stage of his career could have used minor league time to kind of rebuild what he had started in that first season. Because he had some good numbers in his first season, and then it kind of tanked for a little while. And he eventually became a Vezina winning goalie and now two-time Stanley Cup champion. And he's a lock for the Hall of Fame. But early on, it wasn't that way. So he basically forced his way out of Philadelphia. So it's not necessarily that the Flyers just straight up gave up on him. They wanted to see if they couldn't make the Bryzgalov-Bobrovsky tandem work for a little bit. And that was kind of before tandems were a thing. Like, you were still looking at goalies who played 50, 60 games a year. That's what Bobrovsky wanted to be. That's what he wasn't going to get it in Philadelphia, so he wanted out, and that's more or less why they had to make the trade. That being said, also, the Bobrovsky one's a tough one for me too, because it took him 10 years after the trade to even make a Stanley Cup final, to even make it out of the second round, to be honest, in the playoffs. So much time had passed. Like, I wish him well. I think he's had a great career. I don't look at that. Of course, it's a what if for the Flyers, but I don't look at it and go on about it now over a decade later, when it kind of took that long for him to end up on a more well-rounded team that was going to win the Stanley Cup. It took a long time for him to get into the place he was, and he really also kind of revitalized his career a second time over once he got to Florida. It was kind of starting to go a different direction when he was a free agent. He kind of really revitalized his career in Florida.
He's Kevin Durso, our Flyers Insider at 973ESPN.com, at Kevin_Durso on the Twitter X platform. Of course, check out all of his Flyers coverage at 973ESPN.com as he's covering the draft, the offseason, free agency, and of course he joins me throughout the year on 97.3 ESPN. Of course, you heard him typically on game night when I was doing game night during the week, but he was gracious enough to join us now on Saturday afternoons on Hanging with Hennig on 97.3 ESPN. Kevin, keep up the great work, my man. We'll talk soon.
You got it. Thanks, Josh. Appreciate it.